Okay, so tonight's topic is multiculturalism, and that, in a certain sense, is a brand of relativism, so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Now, that term, like many terms from the political discourse, means different things to different people. So I'm going to tell you what I mean by it. I'm going to discuss it according to my meaning. If you feel that I'm not dealing with the subject in an important way, I'm leaving things out, or I've misdescribed it, I'll be happy to hear that. It's first of all, my understanding of the general discussion and also the parts of it that I think are important to examine. So by multiculturalism, I mean two ideas together. The first idea is that cultures are equally valid, true, important, moral, ideal, functional. There's no way in which you can assert that one culture is superior to another culture. They all have to be understood as equal, regarded as equal, and given equal respect and equal validity. And to try to distinguish between them or to judge one as inferior or superior is intellectually ungrounded and is usually a sign of some deep-seated prejudice and imperialism and all the other kinds of terrible things that you could be guilty of, including being overweight. Now, that's one point. And the second point sort of backs up the first point. After all, how would you go about examining cultures to see that one was superior to the other? How would you do that? You'd have to have some standard of success, some standard of validity with which you are going to evaluate the two cultures. But now that standard itself is going to come from some culture. And if you are in the condition of comparing your culture with a foreign culture, and you use a standard from your culture for evaluating cultures, then it's not going to be an objective evaluation because you're going to be using your standard to evaluate your culture and your standard to evaluate the other culture. It wouldn't be terribly surprising if your culture came out ahead. What would you need to make a really objective comparison between two cultures? You'd have to have a standard that was culture neutral. But that's an impossibility. I mean, standards, like a lot of what you think, what you believe, what you experience, are colored by your culture. You're not going to have a standard that's independent of culture. And therefore, if it's your standard judging your culture versus another, it's going to be biased. And if it's, I'll make it equal. I'm judging the relative merits of cultures A and B. I'm going to use a standard from culture C. So then it's cats, dogs, and pebbles. It's just three different realities, and there's no valid way to compare them. That being the case, the idea that you're going to be able to judge that one culture is superior to another culture is a fantasy. So this is multiculturalism as I understand it. All cultures have equal validity, truth, importance, value, and all the rest. And one of the reasons for it is there's no culture-free standard by which you can go about evaluating cultures. On the same page so far? Great, because what I told you is an out-and-out contradiction. It's an out-and-out contradiction. Because if the second point is true, if there's no culturally neutral standard evaluation, not only can you not determine that one culture is superior to another culture, but you also can't determine that they're equal. They're equal is an evaluative comparison. How would you back up the claim that they're equal if you can't evaluate them? So sorry, but if the second point is true, then comparing cultures is out of the question. Whether to compare them to show one is superior or to compare them to other equal, the question can't arise. And now, if the question can't arise, what practical consequences should I draw from that? Should I draw the consequence that I should treat them all equally? Why? I can't assert that they're equal, so why should I treat them all equally? Maybe I should just support the ones that I like, or the ones that I like, and work against the ones that I don't like. What complaint will you have against me? In terms of multiculturalism. So the way I have put the position, it is simply incoherent. Now, I want to apply now the kind of thinking about comparing cultures to certain standard philosophical issues and see how it works. Let's take truth. You will hear people say, each culture has its own truth. Some people will say, each person has his own truth. This is a kind of relativism with respect to truth, and it's much more popular with cultures, but it's also popular with sometimes with individuals. This is not the same as saying there's no truth. That's nihilism. That's another issue. I'm not talking about that at the moment. Maybe if we have time, if you want, I can talk about that as well. But the idea that each culture has its own truth, and the idea of an objective, universal, sometimes called absolute, though that's a misnomer, truth is a mistake. Now, I want to test this. I have two tests and then a critique. I'll explain them all to you, which won't take me long, and then I'll stop for discussion. I want to tell you about 8 years ago. I was in Los Angeles and going to speak at a group at UCLA on some subject or other. And on the way, the fellow who's our contact person there said, by the way, of course they don't believe in truth. Really? They don't believe in truth. How interesting. So as an introduction to what I was going to talk about, I spent 15 minutes talking to them about truth, and I told them the things I'm going to tell you now. And they definitely came out differently from that talk, because no one ever talked to them about it. You can't talk about it. Okay, so I'm talking to now the person who believes in multiculturalism in that sense, and you see every culture has its own truth, and there's nothing beyond that. And I'm going to ask them the following question. I have a project. I know two people, Peter and Paul. Peter belongs to a culture that believes that the earth is round, and therefore he also believes that if you start at the equator and go due west, eventually you come back to the point that you started from. Paul comes from a culture that believes the earth is flat, and therefore they believe, I'm not guessing what they believe, they actually believe that if you start at the equator and go due west, eventually you fall off the edge. Okay, now, I have a project. I'm taking Peter and Paul on a trip. We're going to start at the equator, we're going to go due west, because Paul doesn't want to come along, but I have a gun. So we're going, the three of us. Now, I ask you, the multiculturalist, you tell me what's going to happen on the trip. What's going to happen? Peter comes from a culture that believes the earth is round, and going west is going to come back to where he started. Paul comes from a culture that believes the earth is flat, and that if you keep going west, you're going to fall off the edge. You tell me there's nothing but this culture has its truth, and that culture has its truth, and there's nothing more than that. You tell me, from whatever position you want to take, what's going to happen. If you say that all three of us will come back to the point of origin, I want to know why you are predicting the future on the basis of Peter's cultural truth and ignoring Paul's cultural truth. How did you do that? Why is Peter's cultural truth the source of your prediction and not Paul's? If there's nothing other than this culture has its truth and that culture has its truth. I don't think he can answer that question. Here's another question which is similar in intent but it's a little different in practice. People change their minds. It does happen. People change their minds for lots of different kinds of reasons. One kind of reason that people sometimes change their minds is this. I used to believe A, but I had certain experiences. I went there to places, I talked to people. I tried some experiments, I had certain events happen to me, and I've come to think that I shouldn't believe A, I should believe B. Why? Because A didn't work, or A just didn't describe what happened to me, or A seemed to lead me to be incapable of understanding and dealing with what's in front of me. And B, in retrospect, would have done a much better job. So I've decided to stop believing A and start believing B. Now, I think I've made progress. I think I'm in a better place now. My life situation is better because I threw out the old belief A, which didn't work. I have adopted the new belief B that does work. But now, if all there is their truth, his truth, her truth, my truth, your truth, then all there is what I'm committed to, what I've accepted, what I believe in. Well, I started out committed to believing and accepting A, and now I'm committed to and believing and accepting B. They ought to be equally appropriate, equally valid. All there is what you're committed to, believe, and accept. How could I describe myself as having made any progress? How could I be better off now? Indeed, other than social or cocktail type, party type reasons, what reason would I ever have for changing my mind? How would I put myself in a better position? I started off with something that I already believed and was committed to and accepted. I'm going to move to something which I will believe, be committed to, and accept. How does that make my life any better? Isn't it obvious that there's got to be something outside of me and outside of my particular belief which determines that some beliefs are better than others? Not always. Sometimes you change beliefs for social reasons, and sometimes for medical reasons. There are all sorts of reasons, but there also are reasons of going through experiences and saying, hey, this just doesn't work. It doesn't work. So I'll look for something else, and something else may work better. That's the second problem for the multiculturalism of truth. And the third problem is this. Those two are application problems. Then, having been a professional logician, I can't resist sharing with you the tricky logical step here. So this guy tells us there is no universal, objective, absolute truth. I'm going to define all those terms, and some of them are redundant, and some of them are confused, but that's what he says. There's only what they believe, and their truth, and my truth, and your truth. There's no universal, objective, absolute truth. None. None at all. Well, what about that statement itself? There is no objective, universal, absolute truth. 7 words. How about those 7 words? What's the status of those 7 words? True? Not true? My truth? Your truth? His truth? Her truth? What's the status of that pronouncement itself? This is a trick which is done in a dozen different ways in the 20th century. Turn rules back on themselves. Turn statements back on themselves. Well, what are his options? Could say, listen, I know what it means to be consistent. There's nothing but what you believe and what he believes and what they believe. So sure, this proposition, there is no universal, objective, absolute truth. That proposition itself is just something that this group accepts or that group accepts and so forth and so on, just group to group. Okay, that's consistent, all right, but notice then that he has no reason to critique someone who has a different belief. What about the guy who says, no, there is a truth, and it's not relative. There's a universal, absolute, objective truth. What has he got to say to him? Really nothing, because that's his truth. His truth is that. there's a universal, objective, absolute truth. That's his truth. And according to this fellow, your truth is your truth, and his truth is his truth, her truth is her truth. Usually, the people who push this line are not content to be liberal in that way. They say if you're pushing an absolute truth, you're making a drastic philosophical mistake, and you're doing it because you're biased in your own favor, and you're imperialistic, and you want to impose your views on everybody else, and therefore it's a terrible mistake. But how can it be a mistake if there aren't any mistakes? There's just your truth, and his truth, and their truth, and my truth, and everybody has what they have. Nothing's better than anything else. There's no mistakes. It's just what you have. So if the person is going to be consistent and include his grand major principle that there is no universal, objective, absolute truth, going to include that in the multicultural basket, then he has nothing to say to someone who believes in an absolute truth. Nothing at all. Simply, have a nice day. I have my way, you have your way, and have a nice day. That is not, in fact, the way this proposition is used, or this position is articulated. What's the alternative? The alternative is to say there is no absolute, objective, universal truth, comma, except for this one. This one really is true. This one really is absolute. This one really is universal. This one. And everything else isn't. That's why you guys who think there is, you're making a mistake, because this is really wrong. Well, I think we'll ask him what makes this one different from all the other ones. How come this one escapes the universal solvent that dissolves everything? Why doesn't it dissolve this also? How did you get to it? Why do you justify it? What makes this one different? And then I have a sneaking suspicion that if you really succeeded in telling away why this one counts as objective, that same justification would apply to lots and lots of other ones. I find it very suspicious. No one has ever done this. No one has ever suggested how it could be that this one particular proposition is objective and everything else isn't objective. So I think that the multiculturalist for truth is caught in a dilemma argument. There's either it is absolute or it isn't, and either way he's in deep trouble and he can't get out of it. I think these three examples are enough to show you that multiculturalism, or relative with respect to truth, isn't an option. It just isn't an option. Questions up to here? Yeah.
Sorry, I might have missed this, but Rob mentioned at the beginning that there's standards and that the culture has certain standards. I don't really understand how.
No, I didn't say that. I said that if you were going to try to prove that one culture was superior to another, you would have to be using a standard. I don't say there are standards. I don't know if there are or there aren't. I'm not using that now. I'm just saying you'd have to use one. And then you will ask you, where did you get that standard from? And standards are part of your cultural identity, cultural upbringing, cultural education. So they'll come from a particular culture. And therefore, it won't be valid to use that standard to evaluate another culture, and certainly not to compare your culture with another culture. That's not me talking. That's the multiculturalist talking.
So standards are by definition biased.
That's what he says. I'm going to argue that's wrong, but that's what he says. He says that standards are biased, and therefore you can't make these evaluations. And then he says, therefore you should treat them equally, and that's a contradiction. Yeah.
So for the person who says, let's say, there is no absolute truth, and they also say that statement isn't absolute truth, it's relative. What's the exact issue with that? If you respond with, okay, well then therefore if I say that there is absolute truth, that's also a relative position, and they say yes. If they say that these positions are still relative, what's the...
There's nothing wrong with it, but that's not what they do. They are on a campaign against people who believe in absolute truth. They see it as part of an imperialistic platform from which they can oppress other peoples or deny them their cultures and so forth and so on. If they would be consistent and they'd be liberal about liberalism, then but this is a paradox. I used to give a a shir called The Limits of Liberalism, but it went out of fashion. Maybe I should bring it back. But there would be nothing wrong with it philosophically, but I don't think that's what they do. If they didn't carry it out the way I say, then there would be no problem. It's not an absolute contradiction. Yeah.
What if, like, you can take certain things that, like, most cultures agree on, people having, like, a happy life, or, the ease of life, people not dying so often, less war. Certain things like that are, like, across most cultures, considered valid. What if you take, like, a general, poll of all the cultures and see, what are the main things that all the cultures agree upon, or most of the cultures agree upon, and then use that metric too?
Well, you see, it'll depend upon how you understand what you're doing. If you believe that there's nothing more than the culture's commitment, and you find something, for example, let's take the extreme case, where every culture agrees, then what you have is they all happen to agree what they're committed to. That doesn't change what makes it valid. That's what I would call universal by accident. It's like the difference, let's say, I'm sort of begging the question a little bit, but it's like the difference between vanilla is superior to chocolate versus 2 + 2 is 4. You're going to tell me vanilla is universal to chocolate is a universal truth? It might be. It might be that all people prefer vanilla to chocolate. That could happen, right? But that doesn't mean that it has any truth of its own. It's just an accident that people happen to agree on it. 2 + 2 is 4, whether you agree or not. No one cares whether you agree. If nobody knew it, before there were human beings, you could think it was true. If all human beings ceased to exist, it would be true. If there weren't anything else, it would be true. It's just, it carries its truth by itself. That's what objective truth is. So the bigger difference, what philosophers talk about, the difference between objective and intersubjective. Intersubjective means our subjectivities happen to agree. Objective means it's outside of our subjectivity. The multiculturalist says there's nothing other than what's in your subjectivity. So the fact that it happened to agree wouldn't be universal in the sense in which he denies it. That's why I used all three words, even though they overlap into some of the universal, objective, and absolute, right? The fact that a lot of cultures agree isn't going to make it universal, objective, and absolute. It's just going to be an accident that they happen to agree on.
What was that word you used? That was a good one. The one that meant that everybody's objective opinion was the same.
Intersubjective.
That's a good word.
Intersubjectivity versus objectivity. Yeah.
In order to make that, to even speak that sentence, you need to have a mind that would be capable of, or you need to have a language that could hold that meaning, and then a mind that could receive that and comprehend the sentence. So let's say I had a culture that believed those things were possible, the things that allowed for that statement to even be made, versus a culture that said that they're impossible. How would the multiculturalist answer that problem, that both of them have equivalent values?
Well, the way I've presented multiculturalism, I'm not going to keep the equivalence of the cultures on the table, because to do that, he's contradicting himself straight out. So to keep pounding that contradiction, I don't think is helpful. So let's drop that foolish conclusion that he draws and just stick with the idea that there's no way to measure, and since there's no way to measure, you're not going to be able to know, and draw the more radical, more consistent conclusion that there's no comparisons to be made at all. Right? That's I think what it's more useful to do. Yeah.
I don't see the difference between the phrase "there is no absolute objectional truth" and also the one where it says "except for this one." Are they not the same thing? Because once you say there isn't I don't know the difference between there is an absolute truth and there is no absolute truth except for this one. They're the same thing, because once you say there's an absolute truth, you're implying something else that's true.
Well, let's see. I don't know. I'm going to move a little bit to people who will tell you. I was waiting to hear this from some of you. Oh, Rabbi, the examples you're giving, going around the world, that's physical things. 2 + 2 is 4. That's mathematics. Listen, Rabbi, nobody's talking about that. Nobody cares about that. What we're talking about is values, right and wrong, good and evil, justice, obligation, permission. That's what we're really talking about. And there's no truth. So I admit absolute truth in one area, but I deny it in another area. There's no incoherence there. It isn't if you say, well, if you allowed it here, then it's got to seep over everywhere and cover everything. No, you can have different realms. You say, this area there is, and this area there isn't. So even if you take the example that I gave, everything's relative, everything's multicultural, except for this. So then, the absolute truth will be limited to this one statement, and everything else won't be. Doesn't have to think that because I have it in this statement, it's got to seep out and infect all the other ones. You can divide different realms and say, in this realm there is, and in those realms there isn't. It's just that if you do it this way, if you say this one statement about all the other ones are frail, if this one statement is really absolute, objective, and universal, and all the others aren't, it's going to be very, very difficult to describe, explain why. What is it that makes this one really objectively true and none of the other ones? How do you sequester it off and have a basis for its truth that doesn't also apply to other things? But when you make a motivated distinction like ethics and values on the one hand versus everything else, then a lot of people do hold that position. I don't see any obvious contradiction in what they're saying. The fact that they think that mathematics and geography and medicine are objective doesn't mean that they have to think that ethics is objective. Yeah.
Do you mind if truth be defined?
No, I'm not. Read Appendix 5 of my book. Asking for definitions is usually not justified. It's a showstopper up to junior year in college. And when you get beyond that and you learn a little bit more, you find out that if you want a definition, you have to explain why your request for a definition is relevant. Not always is it relevant. And so far, what we've done tonight is not relevant. Yeah.
The way that you're talking about before, in which we would sequester truth only into areas that could be empirically verified, wouldn't the rest of it, like things like value judgments, wouldn't they just be nihilists in those regards then, not relativists? They're just denying the fact that truth exists in those fields, not the fact that you can't verify it or not, no?
They might be, but I mentioned at the beginning, nihilism is that way. But just to take, for example, what your the verification theory of truth, which when I was at Hopkins in the 70s, there was a collection that came out, The Legacy of Logical Positivism. Only dead people have legacies. That was one of the mainstays of logical positivism. But let's take, for example, a proposition like this. If you believe in evolution, which I don't recommend, but if you do, then you think that somewhere on the Earth's surface, the first cell appeared. Okay? Was it the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere? I think one could argue that that's unverifiable. Does that mean it's not true or false? Surely that seems odd, right? Surely it was either the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere, right? There's no other place on the Earth to be. And if you can't verify which one it was, that doesn't mean it lacks truth value.
Now, I may be lacking here in my knowledge of this subject, but there's something seem logically impossible verification of it. It just seems that we won't have the ability to verify it. But definitely, if someone was there observing it, it could be verified.
Well, yes, but that's not verifiable for us. What do I care that somebody else could have had it?
Okay, so the criteria is us being able to verify.
It should be verifiable. And there are things in mathematics which aren't verifiable. At any rate, so now what I want to do, because that's the heart of the contemporary issue, is to move to that issue. Let me have about 8 minutes to do a burlesque on this. It may be useful intuitively. So different cultures have different standards, and they have different approaches and values and concepts, and they live in their own worlds, and there's nothing to use a standard of one culture to apply to a reality of another culture is a mismatch and is completely invalid. That was the second proposition, which is the underlying understanding of why you're not supposed to say that one is superior to the other. So let's consider the following scenario. I'm visiting some South Sea island somewhere, and they build houses, as some people do, in common. Some people build the roof, and some people build the doors, and some people put in the windows, and some people pave the floor. And here's what they do. When they put up the walls, they send a bunch of people down to a quarry where they have paving stones. The paving stones are 1 foot square. And the people come back carrying bundles of paving stones, and then they use them on the floor. If they need more, then they send more people down and get more. If they have too many, they send the other ones back. That's what they do. So they laid the walls yesterday, and tomorrow they're going to pave it. And I sneak in with my ruler, and I see that the walls on one side are 6 feet, the other side are 8 feet. So I say, let's see, tomorrow, when they go down, I'm going to take 24 guys. I tell them, each of you bring back a paving stone in each hand. Do it my way. I count them out, 24. All you guys go down and come back with 1 stone in each hand. So they do, and they come back, and they pave the floor, and it's exactly right. No extras and no missing. They say to me, how did you do that? How did you do that? That never happens. Either we need to get more, or we have extras to take them back. Very useful. How did you do that? I said, well, I used geometry. 6 times 8 is 48. 2 times 24 is 48. So that's how it works. Wait a minute. Geometry was invented in Greece. And you're in a South Sea island. How can you use a Greek standard in the South Seas? But it'll work, right? It will work, won't it? So I guess geometry is okay, cross-culturally. Now, one of these poor South Sea Islanders suddenly grabs his lower left abdomen and is screaming in pain. And I take out my portable X-ray machine, without which I never travel, and I do an X-ray of his head. He's got a swollen appendix. And I take out my surgery equipment, without which I never travel, and I do the surgery and everything else, and I save him from a burst appendix, and he survives. Could this happen?
Yes.
Sure, it could happen. But the X-ray machine was made in Chicago, and the scalpel was made in France, and the surgical technique was invented in Britain, and I'm in the South Seas. How can I use all these Western cultural standards in a different culture? But somehow it'll work, right? 1 second. Now, these people are desperately poor. And here's how they support themselves. Each one builds his own house. Each one has his own farming material. Each one has his own animals. Each one sews his own clothes. Each one goes mining for important metals. Each one is a total independent economic provision for himself. And I say, I have an idea, guys. I can show you a way to operate. We'll be much richer. You'll have much, much more stuff. One guy should work on roofs. One guy should work on paving stones. One guy should work on wheat. One guy should work on fish. One guy should work on clothes. Specialize. And then trade. You know from history that will work. Of course, division of labor is a Western cultural product. Could it work in the South Seas? Now here you might have psychological resistance. You might have. But you might not. Not guaranteed. And indeed, this type of industrial revolution has taken hold all over the world. West, east, north, south. So how could it be that this Western economic cultural product can be applied in other cultures? What we're finding here is that this intuitive idea, but it's a standard from this culture. Can't use a standard from this culture, that culture. When you take it down to concrete realities, simple, well understood concrete realities, and that's my recommendation. When you're doing philosophy, talking all these heady ideas about the world and reality and so on and so on, try to boil them down to cases which are simple, clear, you feel you have complete control over. Whether it's geometry, or whether it's medicine, or whether it's division of labor, boil it down and see how it works. This idea that the standards of one culture can't be applied to another culture is awful. There are lots and lots of standards where they obviously apply. But maybe not all. Maybe not all. That's where ethics comes in. Before I get to ethics, I want to make one more general remark, and then we're going to talk about ethics. I had a boy here 10 years ago, more. He had gotten involved in Hinduism. And they convinced him to come down and ask me questions. And he said, in Hinduism, they have a famous parable which explains the state of how people live and what their reality is. Once upon a time, there was a very dark cave in which there was no light. And four guys went in, feeling around. And when they came out, they compared their experiences. And one said, I felt a solid, strong pillar, like this far around. The other one said, I felt a long, flexible piece of rope. And another one said, I felt a big flap, like a sail, like this big. And the other one said, I felt a long, flexible hose. Okay, so they have completely different experiences. Now, you and I know that they were feeling parts of a single elephant. You and I know that, right? The leg, the tail, the ear, the snout, the trunk. But they don't know that. So they live in their own separate realities. And that's where we are. We're all locked up in our own separate realities. That's what the point of the parable is supposed to be. So I said to him, let me ask you a question. They came out and they compared their experiences, and experiences were very different. Did they think of the following plan? Let's go back in. But this time, let's connect ourselves with a rope. And then when one of us feels something, he could pull on the rope and could pull us over to him so we could feel the same thing. And then when he feels something, he could pull us over and we'll all feel the same thing. Did they think of that? Wouldn't that help? Wouldn't that equalize their experiences? So he said, well, the Hindu sources don't talk about that. You're right, they don't. They don't. Really, if you have different experiences, does that mean you're locked in different worlds where you can't compare and you can't learn from one another and you can't achieve mutual understanding and mutual accommodation? How is it that in the New York highways you have people from at least 30 different countries and 30 different cultures all driving according to the same traffic laws? Okay, some of them speed, but then that's been all of them, some of them speed. Right? They definitely all have that in common, right? Some of them are irresponsible. How could, you have international chess tournaments? How is it possible from a person from the United States, a person from India, play the same game? How could that be? We're locked up in our own experiences, and our own values, our own cultural point of view, and so forth and so on. How could that be? And here's the corker. You say that your point of view represents your culture, so therefore it's parochial, it's narrow, and it's prejudiced. Might that not depend upon your culture? Suppose your culture has its own private, unique cultural value of examining everybody else's point of view, examining everybody else's ideas, engaging in dialogue with everybody else, and comparing and contrasting to get the best possible result. Maybe you're the only culture on the planet that has that. But wouldn't that escape the cultural isolation? Because your culture teaches you not to be isolated. Your culture teaches you to master the other cultures and learn from them what you can. Couldn't that cultural value overcome the supposed isolation of a cultural point of view? I think it could. I think it's pretty obvious that it could. So the whole argument is hopeless. It's really hopeless. Okay, but now I want to talk about ethics, values, and that sort of thing. There's a lot to say. I'm not saying it tonight. I'm going to go to the bottom argument, which I think works. Most of the things that I say about this subject are completely uncontroversial. I take them from the literature, and they're well known. What I'm going to say now is controversial. Not everybody agrees with me. It's just that I'm right. Just that I'm right. Okay. I was once talking about one of the Eastern scriptures, whether it was the I Ching, the Upanishads, I don't remember. And I made a remark in the shir that some of the things that are written in that scripture aren't true. And one of the students said, you mean they aren't Western true? They aren't Western true. Because you have your own truth. You have your own concept of truth. You have your own standard of truth. And of course, you're applying your Western truth to an Eastern document. That's just not valid. Just not reasonable to do that. Surely, that document is Eastern true, it's just not Western true. Who cares whether it's Western true or not? It's an Eastern document for an Eastern culture. That's what he said. And here's what I responded. You're telling me that there are different concepts of truth. Now, pay attention. We're talking in English, aren't we? You and I are talking in English. So when you say something to me, it has to make sense in English. Now, you're suggesting that they have a different concept of truth. When you say truth, you're speaking English. So I want to ask you, what makes you identify that concept that they have as truth? What makes you think that the concept that they have qualifies for the English description truth? You're locked into a particular framework because you're talking, you're discussing, you're debating, and you want to formulate something that's appropriate. So, imagine that we make decisions about what to do and how to think and how to talk, and so do they. And we do it on the basis of investigation and experience and debate and discussion, so forth and so on. And they do it on the basis of asking the chief and doing what the chief says. That's all. And they believe what the chief says because the chief said so. And somebody says, well, that's their concept of truth. Truth is what the chief says. I say, what the chief says doesn't qualify as Truth in English. Says, well, I don't care about English. Then stop talking. Excuse me, weren't you describing to me why I'm making some kind of mistake? Weren't you describing to me what the real reality is about the situation? When you said they have a different concept of truth from my concept of truth, didn't you mean to say what the English words say because you're talking to me in English? Then play the saxophone. Drink tea. Leave me alone. You're talking to me. You have to talk to me in my language, and the words you say have to be meaningful in my language. And in my language, doing what the chief says isn't any concept of truth. It's not like truth. It's not related to truth. It's just outside the purview. There can be discussions about the various applications of truth, but that's not one of them. So, for example, somebody says to me, imagine, you have a game called chess, right? Well, in China, they play chess differently. Chinese chess. In China, what they do is, it's on horseback in a shallow stream, and there's a lead ball weighing 10 pounds, and you have long, straight sticks. And the idea is to push the ball against the direction of the other team. Half the time you're downstream, they're upstream, and then you reverse it for the other half, and the motion of the ball determines who wins. That's Chinese chess. Really? Chinese chess? I think that's not even a joke, you know. The word chess doesn't apply to that activity. Now, if you told me that in China they play chess without castling, that's something else. Okay, you can remove one rule, and it's got to be similar enough to deserve the term that you're using. But if it's really different, radically different, so then it doesn't deserve the English term. And if it doesn't deserve the English term, then the proposition that it's a different form of X is dead wrong. It's not a form of X at all. So now, let's take ethics. Someone says, you tax the rich in order to give charity to the poor. Some people think that's right, and some people think it's wrong. Some people think that property rights trump charity. Some people think charity trump property rights. And you can have two Americans trained in the same culture who disagree about that. But let's take a culture in which they say in their language, the problem of translation is a problem here also, but okay, say in their language something, and the translation is, it is perfectly permissible to torture small children for fun. Someone says to me, well, you see, Their ethics is different from ours. In our ethics, it's wrong to torture small children for fun. And in their ethics, it's perfectly permissible to torture small children for fun. My question will be, why did you use the word ethics for that? Why do you call it ethics? Maybe what you translate as perfectly permissible really means to them pleasing to the chief, or good for economics, or lowers blood pressure or something. Why did you translate it as ethics? If it disagrees too much with what we take to be the obvious basis of ethics, I'm not going to credit the translation. I'm not going to allow the translation. Translation is a mistake. After all, translation is not written at Sinai. When you translate what other people say, you're guessing to try to understand their meaning. And by the way, this has nothing to do with different languages also. You all must have had multiple times a case where you're discussing something with somebody, and he says something to you that's absolutely bizarre, and you say, so then what do you mean by profit? Or what do you mean by obligation? Or what do you mean by politics? I mean, if that's what you're saying, then according to my meaning of your words, what you say is obviously wrong. You're intelligent. You're not going to make an obvious mistake. So it must be that you don't mean by the words what I mean by the words. That goes on all the time, and it's appropriate to go on because that's what happens. And he tells you what he means by these words. You think, oh, now I got it. Because I don't mean the same thing. We're talking different language. Then you translate back and forth to one another. That goes on all the time. So there's a limit to how far you can credit cultural differences with respect to any subject. And that subject includes ethics. They may not be interested in our ethical terms. They may not have the terms, they may not have the concepts, they may not be part of their culture. It doesn't follow that our cultural terms don't apply. If A tortures B on a condition where B has done nothing to injure A in any way, he's doing something evil. You say, but they don't recognize it as such. So what? Why does my judgment of what they're doing depend upon their recognizing it? I happen to know something they don't know. They don't care about what you know. That's true, fine. But doesn't mean my description isn't correct. They just think my description is not worthwhile thinking about. Good, I can understand that difference. That doesn't mean my description isn't correct. So the idea that cultures are insulated and that you can't judge from one to the other is simply a mistake. Certain types of cultural products are designed to be cross-cultural. And there's no reason to think that always has to fail. The idea that because it's part of your culture, it can't apply to another culture is just a prejudice. There's nothing behind it. There's no justification for it. The examples I gave you are examples where it works for sure, whether it's geometry or it's medicine or it's division of labor. And the idea of describing someone in your language means you're using your concepts to describe what he's doing. There may be cases where your concepts just don't fit. They just have nothing to say. That could happen. But it doesn't always have to. It's not guaranteed always to happen. And when you take a case where B has done nothing to A to injure him in any way or compromise him in any way, and A tortures him, then that's evil, whether they recognize it or not. The idea that they have different moral standards is a nonsensical idea. Yeah.
Good question. Based on what you said previously, would it make a difference in the case of, let's say, the religious documents? Let's say it was a Chinese religious text, and you were presenting, let's say we both knew Chinese. You were presenting why you think it's wrong in English, and I objected to you in Chinese. And let's say we both knew Chinese.
Yeah.
Would that make a difference in the argument here? In that case, I'm not using English to prove my point. I'm calling you, I'm saying you have...
But then why do you think that you're responding to me? Why aren't you just changing the subject? I say in English something about that text, right? And you respond in Chinese. Why do you think you're responding to me? Maybe you're just changing the subject.
Right, so it has to map onto what you're saying.
Otherwise, it's not a response. Otherwise, it's not a dialogue. We're not talking about the same subject. Yeah.
Another question I had as well was that you talked more about, I'm trying to not kind of correctly. You said it was ethical. They mean when they say something, let's say it's good or bad, whether or not they acknowledge it, they're meaning the same thing, even if they're referring to the word good or bad as in different terms.
No.
So, I'm sure I understand.
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is this. if we take two English speakers, right, and they're talking about justice, let's say, and someone says, this and this condition is unjust. The other person says, what? Unjust? Why would that be unjust? I mean, there's nothing unjust about it. You know? Not paying everyone the same wage for doing the same job. See? But some people do it better than others. You know, some people are better at it. They're more productive. They actually accomplish more. So they're doing the same job, but don't you take into account? No, everybody has to be paid exactly the same. And if not, it's not just. I said, well, you must mean something different by justice than I do, because to me it's obviously is just. To you it's obviously unjust. We're both intelligent people. We're both thoughtful people. We're not fooling. We're not lying. So then the only explanation is that we don't have the same meaning for the word. So now let's try to explore the meaning of the word, give descriptions and applications to discover where the difference is. Right? And someone's talking, will say, well, when I say justice, I mean social justice. So I say, I know now. I've got it. Because that's a usage of the word, which in my vocabulary just isn't justice at all. So now we know that we're talking about two different subjects. You're talking about a program to accomplish certain social goals, and I'm talking about moral evaluation of an action irrespective of the goals.
Could there be discrepancies in the concepts themselves? For example, if I actually, and you mentioned at the very beginning, you want to put the nihilism, but if someone's a nihilist and they literally don't think that the word, let's say, justice maps onto any actual, whether it's property or whatever they conceptualize it as, but someone who does use the word justice, they think of it as an actual category, something they're referring to. At that point, would the disagreement, how would that play?
Well, here's a little tricky, because the question is not the application of the word justice. The question is its moral force.
Yeah. Well,
The person can say, well,
refers to.
what's that?
I imagine it'd be more of it's a metaphysical thing. The actual thing it's referring to here, one actually thinks it exists, and the other does not see it as existence.
Well, I would talk about it as being binding. In other words, a person could say, of course I understand that there's justice and injustice. A person does something unjust, don't hire him for your job because you can't trust him to do what you want him to do, so on and so on. But condemn him? I would never dream of doing that. I just draw conclusions about his principles for action, and draw conclusions about his behavior, and I would modify my behavior to interact properly with his behavior. Right? That would leave the moral dimension out altogether, but would preserve justice as a descriptive term. Right? You know, certain actions are just or unjust. What will I do about that? Well, just be careful. That's all. You know, notice some people are colorblind and they have a problem with that, and some people are very lazy. They have a problem with that. And this guy has a problem with distributing things in a fair way. Okay, that's his problem. You know, wouldn't have any complaint about it. Just be careful in terms of my own actions. That could be a use of the word justice as a purely descriptive term. But the idea that he deserves condemnation, he may deserve punishment, that's a bit different idea altogether. That's what, as we're talking about morality in that sense of, and that one should invest in training people to do one or the other, as opposed to, playing the violinist but instead of the saxophone, which is just a matter of how people are, that's all. Yeah.
Couldn't the multiculturalists say that, kind of along the lines of what you said, that these words like justice and ethics, we're using them for certain purposes in our society, but they're not really transferable in the same way that like our scientific knowledge, right, or geometry is, and that if we carry them over on this basis that they'll improve lives in the same way or improve those goals, it won't accomplish those tasks, because those people might say, well, maybe I actually want to like hurt children or whatever, and we have a preference within our culture that this is okay, and for our goals, your words don't work for us, even though we understand your definition and so on. We just have a different setup of what's good and bad.
Yeah, what you say is true, but it had nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about transferring it and remaking them in our image and improving them and doing something good for them. I'm not talking about that at all. Mm-hmm. I'll never talk to them, and I'll never speak to them, or interact with them, but I'm describing the world. I'm an anthropologist, and I travel, and I write a book about all the cultures of the world. And I say, this culture is rife with immoral activity. Right? I'm not going to help them. I'm not going to train them. I'm just doing anthropology.
So they would just deny that that word would have any true deep roots, kind of what he's saying, right? That they're saying that there is no actual underlying morality that allows you to use that word in a way that has real force behind it. They would just say that, well, you're using that for your...
But probably they wouldn't say anything of the kind. What they would say is, you're making remarks about things, and we don't hear any meaning in your remarks. They just, wouldn't have the concepts altogether. If they had a nihilistic position about morality, right? If it was a nihilistic position about morality, not about baseball and butterflies and sandcastles, but about morality, they better understand the concept of morality. And then, meta-ethics is an open field, right? And things have to be explained. And there are nihilists in meta-ethics, but they understand that people see it another way. They understand to a certain extent why they see it another way. They think that they have arguments to undermine why other people see it that way. It's not just, I don't know what you're talking about. Right? Yeah.
So, if you noticed that another group of people does what Jonathan's describing, which is very unethical behaviors, do you just not do anything about it? Do you let them do that?
It'll depend upon, I don't think there's a general answer to that question, neither do you. It depends upon what your leverage is. It depends upon what kind of relationship you are in with them. Do you have control of the police or don't you? What will they do back? Will they murder your children if you go and try to interact with them? I don't think there's a general answer to the question what I would do about it. I don't think there can be a general answer to the question what to do about it. But the fact that they don't agree or they don't have the vocabulary doesn't mean that I have to withdraw my judgment, because the only judgments that there are made by your culture, and nothing beyond your culture counts. That's the point that I'm making vis-a-vis multiculturalism. Yeah.
I just want to clarify, and maybe this is touching on what Jonathan was saying, is when the Rav says that if B is torturing A having done nothing to B, that is evil in our definition of the word evil.
And of course, those last words are redundant, because what else would I be using?
Right.
So you're not really qualifying anything, as if there were an alternative, or maybe somebody else's definition. I mean, it's our concept, it's our language, and we're expressing ourselves in the way that reflects our concepts. That's what you do when you speak language. So of course I'm doing it that way. It's not a qualification, it's just a clarification. Okay, yeah.
So is the Rav basically saying then, though, that it is not objectively evil, independent of what word you're using for it or what language you speak? Is it,
What's objective is a judgment. And judgments are made in words. So of course, it's the words play the role, right? There's a table. Right? That statement is made in English. That statement's meaning depends upon the meaning of the word table. If table meant butterfly, it would be false. But table means table, so it's true. So the statement that it's a table is a true statement because of the reality. But the truth is in the statement. Isn't the table isn't true? It's the statement that's true.
So it is objectively true that it is evil. Now, if you have a different word that you use to describe what we use evil as, then it's true for your word. But it is objectively that thing, however you call it.
That's exactly right. I mean, because what determines truth and falsity is not the sounds or scribble that you use, it's the concept that's behind it. And if the concepts are similar, that's when translation works. It's exactly when translation works. Yeah.
Quickly, like your English-speaking multiculturalists can't come to you, agree to the case, and say, well, that's not really evil. That's a move they can't make.
That's right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. A bicultural person is very useful in these things, where he's lived in both cultures, speaks both languages well, and understands and interacted. What he can tell me is that the word doesn't apply. For example, you might have a culture in which there's no property. Nobody owns anything. Let's say it's a culture, a situation where there's a multiplicity of everything growing naturally, and nobody needs anything that he can't pull off the tree. There's no use for property. So then in that culture, there's no such thing as stealing because there's no property. That could be. The occasions in which we apply our terms might not apply. But that had nothing to do with the culture, that has to do with the economy. If in Palm Beach it was the same way and they're all Americans, we'd say the same thing. There's no property there. It's not going to be a different culture. It's just a different state of being. It's a different state of existence. For example, we have moral rules for parents. People who don't have children, those moral rules don't apply because they're not parents. Yeah.
Sorry. If we have so many different definitions, different cultures have different definitions, how do we get along in, let's say...
I'm denying that. I'm denying that there are different definitions. I'm denying that. I'm saying the fact that you have a lot of cultures does not mean there are different definitions of justice. There are different definitions of goodness, nor different definitions of table, right? I'm denying that. So the way you get along is there's two possibilities. Either they have the concepts or they don't. If they don't, there's no one to talk to. And if they have the concepts, then we can talk and we can discuss and we can interact and learn something from one another. And
we wouldn't ever be able to know which one definition is 100% the most.
That if there were only one culture, we wouldn't know that. Within the Western tradition, philosophical tradition, there are still unsolved problems, and it could be that we'll never solve them. But that had nothing to do with multiculturalism. It has to do with the difficulty of the subject. Yeah.
I remember earlier we were talking about having a kind of like a neutral culture, pretty much try to like relate the other cultures to see what is better or worse. So would either, like in the case of like being like a no-hide, where pretty much this is stuff that people are generally supposed to hold, would that be neutral, or would something like nihilism, towards just absolute absence of all that, be neutral?
No, none of these is neutral. Nihilism is a very substantive position. It says all your understanding of what makes things objective is wrong. That's a position with lots of substance. It denies the reality of a whole set of ideas and features of the world that other people believe in. And there's a real disagreement about how the world runs. But for the disagreement to be meaningful, he's got to understand my concept, understand how my concept applies. You know, it's like phlogiston or other things they used to believe in science. You know, they used to think heat was a liquid. And when you put a hot and a cold thing together, some of the heat liquid flows into the cold one, and that's why they equalize in temperature. And one of the ways they proved that it isn't so, when you heat something up and weigh it, it doesn't get heavier. I mean, it really does, but you can't measure it. The energy of motion gives it some extra weight, but it's 0.00000000001 gram. So you can't measure that. But in terms of the heat and the coldness of the you can't measure a difference in that. So okay, so it's not a fluid, right? So they're talking about a fluid. They did an experiment to discover that there isn't such a fluid. Everybody understood that. They knew what a fluid was. They know what heat is. They thought it was this. They did the experiment. They understood that the experiment shows that it's not so, and therefore they gave it up. Yeah.
If someone had an extremely complete vision of reality or so on, and they were to derive a language out of that, would we have to take as the Jewish position that that language would strongly resemble Lashon HaKodesh?
Oh, for sure. For sure. But it's more than that because, well, you said resemble. I mean, resemble is not a relative term. Mm-hmm. The normal understanding of languages are conventional. Right? There's nothing in T-A-B-L-E that makes it stand for this. T-A-B-L-E could have been horse. Right? It's just it's an accident. We understand that Hebrew is not like that. That the very letters, the names of the letters, the sounds of the letters, and the shapes of the letters have a contribution in describing the thing as it really is. Okay, this is getting